Welcome back to Mindset Hacks, a segment of the podcast where we give you principles and practical tips to raise your resilience, mindset, and mental wellness. On this episode, we're going to talk about something extremely relevant to all of you: performing under pressure. Okay, it's been a long time coming this episode, and I'm extremely happy and glad. This is 10 years coming. I'm going to share why. We have a sports psychologist in the house today, Dr. Harry Lim.
Hi. Nice to meet you, Kevin. Nice
Yes,
to meet you.
thanks for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time out on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, no problem.
To be with us today. I'm not sure whether you may need to be coaching some athletes, but
No.
today?
No, today's fine. I blocked the time out,
Okay.
to do this.
Appreciate that. He's just an introduction. Dr. Harry Lim holds a PhD in sports and exercise psychology, and he works with some of our national youth and senior athletes.
Yeah, that's
Right?
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
So really today we're going to explore pressure. I think we were discussing previously, and you mentioned that there's always a cracking point. Some people believe that there's a cracking point that I always am quite fascinated about this because I'm just especially as a tennis player when I was younger, right? I just wonder why certain players like Federer, Nadal, they can just be so cool under pressure. It's like the stakes are high, inverted commas, there's a match point, and they just play the point. They play the point as if nothing is happening, and they even produce sublime shots during that period.
Yeah.
Whereas some people, during under pressure, for myself when I was playing under pressure, I used to crack a lot. So I'm just really fascinated about the psychology behind it, and how that can be applied to maybe everyday life as well, or high pressurizing performances. So today we're going to talk about what pressure is, maybe why we crack under pressure, and some principles and practical tips to deal with it. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. So maybe just a prelude, right? I know today is more of an instructional podcast, right? But just a prelude to understand your background and just what got you keen in being a sports psychologist initially.
Yeah. I've always been into sports. So I played sports since I was in primary school. I started with basketball, and then moving on to secondary school into football, and then during my army times, a lot of running.
Yep.
So I've always been interested in sports and involved in sports. But the funny thing was I couldn't I did so badly for my A-levels. I couldn't go to a local university.
Right.
So my parents had to ship me off overseas, So I wanted to pick something that wasn't available at that time in Singapore. So I chose to study sports science.
Interesting.
Because it's linked to sports, it's an interest of mine. And unknowingly as well, a few years back, my brother gave me this book.
Okay.
Right, Mind Gym, and it was actually my first introduction to sports psychology. But at the time, I didn't really know that it was sports psychology. I was using a lot of these principles to help me to become a better football player. I was writing notes on masking tape and then sticking them up on my wall to remind me what I needed to do. What my targets are. So at that point, I was really unknowingly using some of these strategies to help me become a better player. And then when I was in university in the second year, there was I remember very distinctively, the module was on motivation. And taking that module, I was like, wow, maybe this is something I want to explore. And then from then on, that was it. Then that became my journey towards becoming a sports psychologist.
Right. I mean, journeys are kind of an understatement because you went to do a PhD, and I'm sure there's a lot of science and research behind it to get it.
Yeah.
So I feel like today I'm really trying to take a learner mindset because if I may share an interesting story, right, when I was younger playing tennis, I would always not perform at the level of my training because when I was competing, there were so many thoughts in my mind, what happens if I lose, I waste my parents' money, what's going to happen in the future, and I just couldn't be present. It's always almost a thing that happened again and again, to the point where one bystander, a friend's parent, actually suggested that, hey, my dad, he said, Kevin, I think he might need to see a sports psychologist. That was about 10 years back, So 10 years later, finally, chatting with me. So we're going to psychoanalyze and kind of break down some issues later on. But it's interesting because I will share a little bit and I'll ask you to, maybe you could ask me some questions as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're going to go broad first before we narrow it down. One teaser question before we go straight into pressure, right? You studied world-class athletes, so I'm sure in your research and things like that. Worked with top athletes as well. Is there some common themes or mindset that makes them resilient or prime for excellence?
I would say maybe I will split it up into two parts. I think individually, I think the desire
Okay.
to want to do well, to play the sport, usually drives these athletes to high levels. Because if you think about it, playing sport yourself as an athlete before, the amount of hours, the amount of time and effort you devote to the sport is actually very substantial. You could be using that time to go out with friends, to have fun, to do other things maybe normal teenagers would do. But because you are invested in your sport, you spend that sort of time in. And what we typically see is those that do well have this desire, have this determination, to want to succeed, want to do the very best in the sport.
Sure.
Yeah. On the other hand, I think the environment is also very important in supporting excellence, right?
Okay.
So if you have those individual qualities, if the environment is matches up to you, then you have a much stronger or much higher chance of succeeding as an athlete. I think if you look at a lot of our top local athletes, at least they have strong support networks, be it the family, the coaches. So these are also very important elements to consider when we talk about excellence. I think for a long time we look at individual performance, right? But we forget there's a lot of other factors that come into play, and the environment really plays a big role in that.
Yeah, this is consistent also with a lot of research into resilience in schools and even building grit. That it's contextual. Like there needs to be an environment where they can practice that, and also people that support them and bring out the best in them. Wow, that's just interesting. The desire, as well, the desire. I'm sure it's also not just in sport, but any endeavor, like be an entrepreneur, whether you want to pursue a passion, the intrinsic drive has to be there.
I think you mentioned, even in other endeavors, is being able to pick yourself up when you fall, and you will fall many times. Right, in sport, in business, in life. I like to encourage my younger athletes to fail early on.
Okay, nice.
Right, because if you don't learn how to deal with failure early on, imagine when it hits you when you're 25, you're gonna struggle to learn how to deal with it. But if you are introducing the notion that failure is a learning process, failure is something that can bring you positives, and at a very early age, then I think athletes will start to fear less about failure. Failure will start to see it as a stepping stone. And I think not enough of that is currently being done. Right, in encouraging failure or facilitating that process. In a sense.
That is wow. I feel like if I could exclaim, I will because it's exactly the word rebound and resilience. That's what we're trying to do. Just to reframe the way you view failure, right? Not as a personal permanent stigma, but really an exciting opportunity for feedback, for growth. And resilience must have failure, right? If you look at resilience, right, the element is that you need to adapt to failure. But if we kind of stigmatize it and we don't prepare them to deal with it, like you said, right? Then when that bigger failure comes, they are inept to actually deal with it. So and I think I interviewed UK Sham, is actually a record holder for a podcast for 100 meters. I was asking about this, like why sport should be talked about more, and he said that because the values to do well in sport underpins the values to do well in life as well. And I concur with that because I learned so many intangible lessons in my sporting career. And I think even if you do not play sport, right, I think certain principles we also talk about. Yes, we'll reference sports a bit, but we'll also really go into some practices that can help you regardless of whether it's in a sports context or not. So look forward to that. Okay, let's get into the podcast.
Problem, man.
I actually wore my Tech Hoya watch today. So
it's a very, very beautiful watch.
Don't crack under pressure, right? Some of the things that I try to remind myself. But let's explore the science of pressure a little bit. Like when we say pressure, right, what is actually, like if you could break it down to a chemical level or a scientific level, what's actually happening?
Well, I mean, I googled the physics, right? Of it. It's really a pressure, a force that's applied perpendicular to a surface.
Okay.
Right. I think that's the general scientific definition of pressure.
Sure.
But we talk about it in the context of sports. Is really being able to that the pressure comes from, for me, the expectations perhaps that an athlete has, or the particular competition or whatever is at stake, right? I just had a conversation with one of my athletes yesterday who is preparing for SEA Games, for instance, and he has been doing very well the last couple of competitions,
Sure.
and then suddenly come and look for me saying, "Oh, I'm starting to feel the pressure." But what's the difference is really the last competitions that he has done very, very well. There was nothing at stake. There was nothing on the line. Now there's something on the line. And I think that's where pressure comes, right?
Okay.
Because there is now something to lose or something to gain.
Sure.
Right. And I think in the context of sport, at least in the sport psychology, I think that's where the pressure inevitably comes when you have something on the line that you care about.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, that is how I would say that was how I would conceptualize pressure, particularly in a sports psychology context.
I would think it's also similar to just as an entrepreneur doing a pitch for a presentation, or a student taking his exams where there's something on the line. Is in his perception is a big thing on the line. For me, that was my A levels that caused me that pressure. What's happening at the chemical level? Is it similar to a stress response, or are there like some differences? Because we know a stress response is that for those of you that don't know, it's when you get anxious and then blood goes. You're studying science, like you can just Google fight or flight response, cortisol being released, adrenaline, and then your pupils dilate and all those other things, right? But is it similar, or is there some like differences?
Yeah, I would say. Well, it's really when it boils down is the anxiety, right?
Okay.
We feel the anxiety, but anxiety doesn't necessarily always have to be bad. So in sports psych, we talk about debilitative anxiety, the one that we're perhaps most familiar with, but there's also facilitative anxiety, right? So in order to perform at your very best, you need some level of anxiety or stress, right? The problem arises is when you feel you don't have enough coping strategies or enough skills within you to cope with the stress, and that's where it becomes debilitative. Right? Yeah.
That's what we're going to talk about. I was just talking to a psychologist in an institution. He was sharing with me about eustress and distress. Where distress is like, optimal level of performance. Maybe we'll put in the graph here where, eustress is good stress, and then it comes to a point where after that becomes distress and it affects performance. So we're going to talk about that. In the context of... so the next question I'd like to ask is why do we actually... I think you already kind of briefly talked about it. But in the context of sport, like why do we crack under pressure? Could you share a little bit more about it? Maybe real life examples of world-class athletes or even people you might have worked with before. What does that look like, and why do we actually crack under pressure?
Yeah. Well, I guess what it looks like is in terms of not being able to perform under pressure is when you have the skills and you have shown that you're able to produce that level of performance, but under that particular in a pressure situation, you are unable to bring out that level of performance. We're not even talking about extremely good performance, just your usual standards. For example, you mentioned you were unable to bring in sort of your training form into your competition matches, right? And it's basically that unable to translate what you would normally do very well, and then when it comes to those competitive pressure situations, you are nowhere near the standard you can perform at, right? I think we're talking about world-class examples. One example that I usually like to reference is this American Olympian shooter, right? So he's very well known for the gold medals he didn't win, right? So in 2 Olympics, he was in the same event going to the final shot. He was leading, and he just needed to do normal, right? In the first Olympics, he misfired, he shot into somebody else's target. So he went from first to last, he shot 0. In the second Olympics, he shot a 4.4, which is an amateur kind of shot, right? And then he went from first to fourth, so in 2 Olympics, he in that particular event, people will say he choked in a sense, right? Because he's a world champion. He has won world championships. He has won this event multiple times, in different various different other competitions. So that you could perceive as a sign of choking under pressure, right?
Sure.
Because in any typical situation, he would have been able to pull those shots, no problem. Pull those shots off, no problem.
Okay.
Why in these particular two situations, he was unable to? Yeah.
Did he share why? Did he share why in the interviews and any factors that led to that?
Yeah. Well, people would label him
of course,
as a choker
people,
from what you understand the term and what you see. But I think that is where he's really, for me, resilient.
Okay.
Right? Because he just sees it as a mistake.
Just brush it out. Okay.
Yeah, and it's something that is done. I just got to move on. And I really, really admire his resilience and optimism. And actually, even though he didn't win those two gold medals, he actually won a gold medal in another event. So people forget that he has a lot of other achievements, but they just focus on that particular.
What's his name?
Matt Emmons. His story is phenomenal. I feel he shows you the bad, I would say the negative side of perhaps dealing or not being able to deal with pressure. But if you look at it in a holistic perspective, he has shown I would say very good characteristics, psychological characteristics that any athlete should have, that resilience, that optimism, that determination to continue.
Yeah, I think people don't see people generally humans they like to see the small cockroach in the it's wired for negativity very negativity bias. But we talk about choking. So let's explore a little bit about choking, because it's a term that maybe people listening for the first time, I think I'm familiar with it because I choked a lot. Can you share that in a while? But for viewers, right, what is actually the signs, or even when people say choking, what does it mean?
Yeah, I think like you mentioned, you have a lot of thoughts in your mind.
Yeah.
You're unable to find clarity of what you need to do. Yeah. And usually in the context of sports, at least, choking typically happens when you overthink. When you start to overthink your movements, for instance. So for example, in the sport of tennis, your serves, when you are serving, you don't typically think about how high I have to throw the ball, what's my angle of my hand, the angle of the racket to hit. You don't think about these things in minor detail because you have already done those things over and over again, right? Yeah. But under pressure, usually, we feel like we need to be in control because we feel things might go wrong. So something you might think like, oh, I need to make sure my serve is perfect today because the opponent is this or that.
Right.
And you start to think,
oh, yes,
I need to throw the ball in this angle. I need to hit the ball with this particular speed. What you lose there is the years of training you put in to make things automatic.
Right.
Then you become in a sense, an amateur again because you're doing things very step
mechanically,
by step. Mechanically. Okay. And that stops you from performing the way you usually perform.
I read about this, actually interesting. I think I did send you the article. I think, of course, that was written 20 years back. So some of it might be outdated already. But in 2000, I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote an article called The Art of Failure, where he broke down why some people choke and why some people panic. He was just talking about the difference in between choking and panicking, which I guess I'll go into. But he said that choking is when you overthink. As like you said, in sport, it's very automatic, right? At first, when I learned the sport, I learned how to hit a forehand, I learned how to hit a backhand, it becomes subconscious. Yeah. But exactly what you're saying, right? In a match, when when I overthink, I think of the consequences of losing, I just revert back to my the technical term for I think is implicit and explicit learning. Right? Like explicit means you think about it, right? And then after that, it's implicit, where it's just subconscious. Yeah. And that is where my strokes function best at a subconscious level. But when I stop that by thinking, everything goes haywire. So I know I went all over the place there, but basically choking is thinking too much.
Yeah. I think it's thinking too much and trying to have too much control over the situation because you are kind of thinking about all sorts of different scenarios, right? And usually these are all negative scenarios. And what you're trying to do is by trying to gain back some form of temporary control. And what you feel is if I am more mindful of my movements, if I pay more attention to my skills, I'm going to have more control, But that is kind of in the moment thinking, right? That you feel these things can help. But if you are trained, if you have been taught the right coping strategies and skills, then you will know that what I need to do is really to calm down and to start taking things back to the basics. Be very, vague and very broad in how you give yourself instructions. Instructions are good, like it anchors you to what you need to do. So could it be in the context of tennis? It's just like there's a very simple study. I remember them talking about implicit maybe how to give instruction in order to coach kids, right? They just bounce, hit, bounce, hit, bounce, hit. It's not like angle at your racket at a certain angle, right? And it helps kids learn that skill a lot more effectively than if you will give them very clear instructions, very complicated instructions, right? So in the context of a high pressure situation, it will be very similar. You want to keep things simple.
No wonder my coach keeps saying, keep things simple. But and you keep bringing up the word control, right? And I finally understand maybe why I choke so much, because I have this obsessive need for control. Even in my life, I think that's what led to also depression as well, that I just cannot surrender control. But it's certain circumstances. I know we talk a lot about in a sporting context, right? But I believe it's also similar to a general context, right? Giving a presentation, doing a pitch. There's a lot at stake. And then we kind of overthink the situation, and then we can't perform at a subconscious level. There's one thing I read, just let me know if this is like unscientific or not. but I read that loss aversion, one factor that results in people choking more is loss aversion, meaning they want to win very badly. The more badly they want to win, the higher chance that or rather it's more linked to choking, because when the potential prize is very big, right? That loss aversion is very great. I think I experienced it a lot, especially in bigger competitions, where I kind of, in the match, keep thinking about what's at stake. To the point where I just cannot hit a proper forehand, because I'm just thinking about, wow, this is so much at stake there. All the people are going to praise me. What happens if I don't get it? The embarrassment. Is it something that you read about as well?
I think it's very common. I find that very common in my experience with a lot of athletes. And I think what you are confronting with is a distraction. Right? Because if you think about it, you're thinking about how people are going to praise me, what I'm going to do after I win, that sort of thing. Your mind is too far in the future. Your mind is not in the present. Your mind is not focused on the immediate point you need to win. Right? So oftentimes people either think too far ahead, right? Like what the example you mentioned, or they are not able to let go of the past. So if they made a mistake, in the previous point, they might be constantly thinking about the mistake, beating themselves up over the mistake. And then not being present to what is in front of them at that point in time. Right? So there are usually two. Either you think too far ahead, or you're unable to get past the past, in a sense.
That's a very good segue into actually talking about the solutions as well, because now that we kind of have a rough handle of the problem, we can understand why they might choke or crack under pressure. We can go into the principles that help. Before that, I think I'll probably link the article, because I think it's interesting for you to read. I don't want to go into it because Malcolm Gladwell did talk about panicking as well. He said that panicking is like, kind of inverted commas, colloquially the opposite of choking, where choking is thinking too much and panicking is thinking too little. Where under a high pressure situation, people like breathing down your neck, a lot of stuff. There's studies that people just forget information. they blank out, right? They forget simple things. For example, like in scuba diving, in the example he gave was that he lost the air, and it was a simple solution. He had another air. I mean, all scuba divers know that's the most basic thing. But what he did was he panicked. He grabbed the other person's air supply, which is the worst thing you can do in that situation. And we also quoted this thing called perceptual narrowing, where your perception becomes very narrowed. And of course, the antidote to that was having more experience, because that you can revert back to into that. So I'll link that up for you to look at. I think that's interesting. But in the interest of time, we want to go into the principles. What are some broad principles or philosophies, right, that helps people deal with pressure? From research or personal experiences?
I think from my personal experience, at least, I think it's managing your expectations. I think that's vitally important to know I think we spoke about it briefly just now, what is it that you are nervous about, right? And I like to get my athletes to be honest, because it's only through that then we can work through possible solutions. I think it's the idea of what is it you're expecting, right? Because we don't feel pressure for no situation, for no apparent reason. Nobody feels pressure because they like to feel pressure. Pressure comes about because, as mentioned, you have something on the line usually, or you have something to lose, you have something to gain, right? Oftentimes, true experience is like, a place in a competition, a medal. It could also be how people view you, right? So if you talk about in the context of public speaking, right, we want to be able to have good kind of feedback. We want to be seen as doing a good job. So in public speaking, people have this fear of public speaking. Usually is because they are worried about how
judgment. For sure.
How other might look at them, right? And I guess it's sometimes reframing some of these fears, right? So for instance, if my athlete fears how other people will look at them, then we go through, why is this an important thing to you? Are there other ways we can look at it, right? Is it realistic? Is it a rational or irrational kind of thinking, right? Because oftentimes a lot of the thoughts that we have are irrational in a sense, particularly in these high pressure situations, right? You talk about, am I going to win? Am I going to lose? Actually, you don't even know whether you're going to win or lose it, right? But you're really thinking about the outcomes before you even played the game, and that, in a sense, brings you away from the moment that you're supposed to be focused on. Yeah.
There was a quote by the way, I forgot to mention how we connected. It was actually during a talk about Alma Mater. Now is RIJC, but back then it was RJC. And it was a talk, I think it was a day on dealing with stress. That day is dealing with stress. So I was sharing my story and encouraging the students. Immediately after me, I think Dr. Harry was due to speak. So he gave a presentation and I stayed. I stayed for the presentation. I took notes and I was just, wow. And I was just thinking that day that I'm going to talk about pressure, and all of a sudden you appeared. So I thought that I'll contact you. But I think in the presentation, right, you did mention about Serena Williams.
Yeah.
You gave a picture of her, right? And then the quote was that when you're losing, don't think about the outcome, don't think about anything, just focus on the next point.
Yeah.
Like focus on the present, the next point. How am I going to win? Like just the next point. And it seems that you talk about focusing on the present a lot. So I think that's something we want to explore when it comes to practices. But one thing that I also want to share, right, is that for me, that difference for me was when I stopped caring too much. That means I just let go. It's same thing like being the present. But for me, it was just like, I read a bit also that some athletes just don't care. They just say, in the grand scheme of things, they just a match. They just surrender that control. When I was playing inter-school games, somehow I performed very well. I was enjoying it. I was loving it. Even though I had not practiced for very long, this was in university already, but I just enjoyed the game and I just could play much better compared to when I was younger.
Yeah.
So I think that that helps as well.
Yes, definitely. But I think surrendering control is difficult.
Right.
And I think sometimes also athletes are perfectionists.
Right.
A lot of them are perfectionists. They want things to be perfect, right? And we will usually go through this exercise with them. What is it you can control, and what is it you can't control? We try to list them all out, because the things that you cannot control, thinking about them is just a waste of your energy. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your effort, and it's not going to help you at all, right? So, for example, in the context of tennis, thinking about winning or losing, actually, you can't control the outcome because you are playing against an opponent. You are not going to know how the opponent is going to behave, is going to react, right? What can you control? You can control your own mind. For instance, you can control the thoughts that come through. You can control how you prepare, right? Talk about using pre-performance routines to help set you up to be in the best possible state. You can choose how you respond to bad points. You can choose how you respond to bad umpiring calls, for instance. So these are the things we can control. You cannot control how the umpire is going to call, but you can most certainly control how you respond to it. And oftentimes you see a lot of players go ballistic if it's a bad call. And that affects their game so much, right? So unless you're John McEnroe, because John McEnroe he does it on purpose, right? He does it on purpose. So if you're doing it on purpose, it's okay. He knows what he's doing. So his outburst, he knows
meant
exactly
to
what
increase performance. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas other people, when you see them do those kind of outbursts, you know their game will suffer. Unless they some you will see they are able to recover because they recognize they are going down a particular path, and then they are doing some sort of recovery strategies to help them to bring them back into competing in the moment.
Djokovic is one example. He's really consistent over the years, right?
Yeah.
I know we're throwing a lot of jargon, but let me put some pictures in. You talk about control and not. I think self-efficacy is one principle that I share a lot in this podcast. We follow this as well. Talk about programs. I think when we draw two circles, right, what you can control and what you can't on the outside, I think that's one exercise you can do. You hear it a lot. I want to say this. You hear this a lot. But this is not a new concept, right? You hear this a lot. But one thing you can do to really help is, like what you mentioned, really write down a piece of paper, draw two circles, the outer circle and the inner circle, and just like really write down. Because when you write down, you start to think, hey, actually these are some things there. It's not just in your head. And this is a principle that's really across universally being important. So definitely keep that in mind. What you can control and not. So let's talk about what we can control, specifically on practices, specific practices. What are some practices that you help athletes with that maybe can be translated to in any situation if someone's under pressure?
I think, having a way of preparing yourself, right? Having a routine of how you want to set yourself up for competition, I think is important, because what you're looking to have is consistency, right? You want to make sure if you're doing a routine and it's consistent, then that sort of spills over into your performance, right? And this routine is not just for competition, it's how you prepare in training, right? Oftentimes, if you don't take training seriously, unfortunately, I would say 9 out of 10 people, athletes particularly, would not be able to then perform to their training standard. You might have the odd one out who is a big game player in a sense. Those athletes would just somehow
channel something.
Able to perform in those big games. But let's not talk about them. Those are the rare ones. For the other 90%, right? Having routines help because they bring you a level of focus, because step by step this is what I'm going to do, right? And this is things that I would consistently do over and over again. Because if you do these things in training, you get certain results, right? And then when you do it in competition, you kind of also expecting something similar. You might not get exactly the same, but because I'm doing these things consistently, I can expect a certain level of consistency in my performance as well.
Yeah, we've cut in here. It's Justin from Instagram. I did put out on Instagram what helps people cope with pressure. This guy Justin, he wrote to work on factors of self-efficacy, which we talked about, and reduce performance anxiety through a pre-performance routine. So exactly what we talked about in the last 10 minutes.
I think self-efficacy, right, or at least self-confidence in a sense. I think in sports, for a long time, we placed a lot of emphasis on self-confidence. If you're confident, you're going to do well. But I think based on your experience, that maybe confidence is rather fleeting sometimes, right? It comes and goes. I think more and more now we are exploring this notion of courage, because, can you do the things you need to do even when you're not confident, right? And it's being courageous, right? Despite facing the difficulties, I'm still going to continue doing things in a certain manner, right? And because sometimes if you think about, I'm not confident, I'm not going to do this, because you don't feel confident doing it,
and then
it doesn't help the situation, right? You actually need to do that. But can we think about it in the terms of being courageous?
Sure.
Right? I will still do this despite knowing that perhaps it's not going to help, but because that is what is required. And oftentimes we need to sometimes take one step back before we can move 2 steps forward. And sometimes is be willing to look bad, be willing to feel bad, be willing to perform bad in order to find the 2 steps forward. And I think oftentimes with confidence, you don't allow yourself to do that because you want things to be good, right? If things are not good, it affects your confidence in a sense. Because we draw, for example, self-efficacy. One of the scientifically defined ways that your increased self-efficacy is through successful performance. Right? The more success you get, the more your self-efficacy increases. You know, but life, you're not gonna win all the time. You gotta. For me, in a very simple way, is to learn to roll with the punches. Right? You will have highs, you will have lows. You need to know that the lows will not last all the time. That's why I feel that courage is important in those situations.
Yeah, I really love that because courage is you need. The word courage can only exist in the presence of fear. Like, I cannot use the word courage without an element of fear. If there's no, I mean, what courage, right? You don't need to be courageous. It's always the element of fear, and you act despite it. I think there's a quote that says, "Courage is not the absence of fear; it's acting in spite it." And I think I love that because, like, it's a discipline, right? Whether you feel motivated, whether you feel confident, you discipline yourself to say, you know what, I'm going to act despite feeling this way. And I think that's maybe a bit might be more helpful for people because they don't feel up to it all the time. But when they can say that, hey, you know what, I can be courageous, that like an anchor. That's like an anchor for them. And it helps.
It's almost like a compass, right? To when you are lost, knowing that, being courageous, can be that guiding point for you, right? Yeah. And I think maybe perhaps bringing it back more specific to a sports context, right? Other strategies could be having very simple keywords, as mentioned just now, you don't think about all the complicated movements you need to make. Just very simple cues for you to perform the action, right? To bring you some level of focus.
I think that applies to any situation, right? Certain small cues that can anchor them and serve as compasses. So think about that. When you're performing in a high performance situation, right? Is there any cues or any small things you can just kind of focus your attention on instead of like everything that's happening around you? I think that helps even for public speaking as well. When I speak to big crowds, I tend, what has really helped me, right? It's not to focus outward and embarrassment and judgment. It's really to focus on my service, what I tend to give, the points that I'm trying to make, the courage and the vulnerability I have. So really focusing on that instead of thinking about what I could potentially be judged for. I think that really helps me in a situation where there's inverted commas high pressure.
I think what you have done there is reframing the situation, right? Okay. So you're looking at it from a different perspective, like what you can gain as opposed to what you can lose.
Okay.
Right? You talk about the positive. You're looking at the positives rather than focusing on the negatives, and I think that's important. You know? And I think another thing that people can do is really be honest with themselves about what they are feeling. Also understand the thoughts that you have, and I think as well the associated feelings and sensations that you feel as a result of those thoughts. Because for me, I think awareness is very important. Awareness is the first step to finding the solution. If you are not aware that you're feeling this way, then you don't actually know that this is detrimental to you in a sense, right? So, for instance, like you talk about your experiences with tennis at that point in time.
Back then there was no awareness, right?
You didn't. You were not aware that these things were stopping you or were in the way of you performing. But once you get an appreciation, then I think that's where the solutions start to appear, or the doors to the solution starts to appear.
I love that because I always talk about 3 A's to change, right? Awareness, action, and association. And the first step is awareness. If you don't know your blind spots, right, then it's very hard to tackle them or give solutions to that. So I think for audience, practical tip is really to write down, like you said, put it down on paper. Raise your awareness lah. What are some things that actually might be causing you to feel a certain way, and then reframe them. And you mentioned it's not about what you can lose, but what you stand to gain. I'll add a caveat to that. It's what you can give. Because for me, what really helps is actually my principal board over there, right? I say that fear is preceded by ego. Fear is preceded by ego, and there's no fear in the spirit of service. A lot of my fears when I'm doing business or speaking, it's all based on the fact of what I stand to lose and my ego. When I can redirect that and about the service I'm providing, the lives I'm changing, and then it's like almost as if like, you know what, no matter what, Kevin, this is what you're doing for them. It's not about you anymore. It's not about you. So stop thinking about that. I think that really helps me personally. That's what I want to share. Hopefully y'all can also think about that as well. One or two more last things. I think I read a bit about guided imagery, and you also shared a bit about that. Is it something that you help? That means like really to visualize performing in that particular situation, maybe also visualize the obstacles that could come and how you deal with it. Is that something that helps?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we teach our athletes and we encourage them to do. So imagery, in a sense, there are two ways you can use it. You can use it as instructional imagery, so in terms of skill execution, or you can also use it as motivation, right? Imagining scenarios where you do well, or preparation, right? So you can also imagine scenarios where you don't do well, so that you can find solutions in your mind, right? So that when it does happen, it's not something that's foreign to you, right? So even in the context of the diving situation that Malcolm Gladwell mentioned, so if let's say they have done some imagery work before, teaching them how to deal
what
with
happened if it becomes familiar?
So that when it happens, they know, oh shit, I've gone through this before. This is what I should do. Don't panic so much.
Right.
In a sense, what we try to do is sometimes we get them to think about these different scenarios and to practice these scenarios on how they are going to deal with it. So they have some in their minds. They really have some sort of strategies or solutions to deal with the situation. One very I guess particular incident in sport, high level sport itself, that speaks to this is Michael Phelps, right? So Michael Phelps, I think in 2008, I think in in the 7th race where he was going to match the most number of gold medals in a competition in the Olympics. In an event, he dived in and his goggles flipped.
Oh,
so he had water in his goggles.
Oh yes, I read about it briefly.
Yet he was still able to finish in gold medal position, right? So when they interviewed him after, and the coach as well, what they said was actually they have practiced for this scenario over and over again.
Wow.
They have practiced swimming blind.
Wow.
So they have met that preparation
before.
So he knew how many strokes he needed to hit the timing that he needed.
Wow.
So that sort of preparation, I would say that's the extreme end, really high level kind of imagery and preparation work that you do to help you prepare for this.
It's crazy.
For this scenario.
Wow. I got goosebumps listening to that. It's like introducing adversity, so to speak. Of course, use it in context. Please don't introduce adversity on purpose. Not as a word for
I think no. You should introduce adversity as much as you can.
Okay.
But the important part is you need to facilitate that adversity.
Okay.
So if, let's say, you put your athlete under an adversity situation, but you don't do anything to facilitate that kid's gonna crack and he's not going to then recover.
And then the confidence gets hit.
Then it gets hit. But if you put them in the adversity situation, but you facilitate that process for them as a learning experience, what they should be looking out for, what you're challenging them for, then they have the tools then to deal with this adversity, even if they are not able to at that point in time overcome it. But they know that this is they know the ways to go about managing it in a sense. So a lot of what I try to do now is try to find ways that can trigger my athletes, particularly knowing that these things hurt them, these things kind of affect them, distract them. I would find ways to do that.
Wow.
But at the back end, I will facilitate that process, right? We will talk about how we're going to cope with these difficult situations if they arise, and then I together with the coach, we will discuss these things and how we can introduce difficult situations for them to deal with and to practice these coping strategies that we've talked about before. So the facilitation bit is very important. I think oftentimes, I think in life as well, we don't necessarily put ourselves through the difficult situations. So like, for example, if you have a fear of public speaking, right? How comfortable are you going out in the streets to ask strangers about things? That could be one way to build that sort of that sort of resistance.
Yes.
Or comfort.
For sure. I love that. That's a very good practical tip for all of you there listening. It may not be in the context of sport, right? But think about visualizing the situation and the challenges, because visualization, some people think it's just visualizing the best possible outcome. I think that helps, but it's also about visualizing what are obstacles along the way and visualizing yourself actually going through and tackling those obstacles. Like in the public speaking context, it could be people are noisy and then how I deal with that and everything. But facilitating that process, whether is it mentally or even putting yourself in a scenario where you practice that response to adversity helps. So I think that's a really good practical tip you can take back. I think the last thing I want to talk about is presence. Because we spoke a lot about mindfulness presence, right? It's a huge topic by itself. I think there's so many strategies, but in the interest of time, right? What is just one thing that perhaps can help people be more present in the situation?
Yeah, I think like you said, mindfulness is very trendy now in a sense. In the context of sport, we use elements of mindfulness, but I think we would like to call it like present moment focus.
Okay.
And really how to come in contact with the present, right? So the breath is one very easy way to come back into the present. But interestingly, breathing, if not done correctly, will not help, right?
Okay.
So oftentimes what we try to get the athletes to do is when you're breathing, make sure you're focusing on the breath, right? Focusing on the inhalation or exhalation process, because that drives your attention a little bit more inwards.
Okay.
Because oftentimes if you are breathing, but if you're still thinking about, am I going to win? Am I going to lose?
Doesn't help.
Yeah, it doesn't help the situation, right? And then other things you could do is like, just being standing still, feeling your contact with the ground, your feet on the ground, rocking back and forth. So what you're just trying to do is bring yourself back into clarity, what I'll call clarity, your bodily sensation. So you are not getting distracted by the noise, by the thoughts, by the crowd, and then that gives you, I think, a better chance of making an informed choice.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Wow. I think that's one really good way to kind of wind down on this podcast. I think even a previous session, I talked to a budding psychologist about how to deal with ruminations, which means that in this context, just thinking about the past. And I love how sport is kind of amplified in that situation, but the principles can also be applied back to real life where you face anxiety, whatever, you bring your breath back to the present, you kind of grounding, elements of grounding where you feel your feet. It all really helps you on. So do go look more into that about how you can keep yourself mindful and present. I think that will help in any situation. With that, I think I want to share just one last thing before we close, right? And of course, give you time to have a closing message. One thing that really impacted me when I about this topic is listening to The Rock. The Rock, Dwayne Johnson.
Dwayne Johnson.
He was speaking to a bunch of elite youth basketball players in a speech. And he was just sharing about how he deals with a big moment or situation. Before he goes into it, he tends to imagine himself with the back against the wall. He tends to imagine himself like, think about how far he has actually come. All those moments where, he said that, okay, yes, you're going to go in a big situation, but remember, this is where you come from.
Yeah.
Like, you have really come so far already. Remember, have gratitude for the moments, right?
Yeah.
that because you're so sucky in the past and now you have this moment.
Yeah.
So it kind of gives like an anchor to him that he said, no matter what, I'm proud of how far I've come. And I'm going to go into this just with a serving attitude.
Yeah.
So I think that helped me also before a big event to think that, hey, you know what, no matter what, I'm not depressed.
Yeah.
And I've come a long way from that. Gratitude.
I think what you have is also, you have found a purpose.
Right.
Right. You talk about giving.
Yeah.
And I think that drives you, right? So that it becomes your purpose. So in a sense, that is your courage.
Sure.
You have this guiding light. Like,
Right.
I know why I'm doing this thing for, why I want to do these things.
Yeah.
So even though I might fear judgment when I'm doing public speaking, but your ultimate purpose drives you to do that, forces you in a sense, because you are clear about your purpose.
Sure.
Yeah, so when you have that purpose, I think it also, things become infinitely maybe easier.
Right.
I wouldn't say easier, you still have difficulties, but you are more likely to stay on that road.
Okay.
In that sense. Yeah.
Thanks for giving me that perspective and adding on to that. I love that. Now I always remember that. Is there any last message you want to share with anyone dealing with pressure, or any last words of encouragement for them?
Yeah, well, maybe just, I think I mentioned to you just now, I think it's seeing failure in a different light. I think society-wise, Asians, we don't particularly like to deal with failure. It almost is a blow to the ego, and we can understand why. But I think it's seeing failure as something that can bring us to the next level, can help us learn. It can be a positive thing. And if possible, start failing from young.
Okay.
Learn to deal with failure from young. And I think you build the skills, you build the confidence to deal with failure as you go along.
Sure.
The more you fail, the obviously that process has to be facilitated, as mentioned. Otherwise if you just fail, you probably give up, right? You lose motivation.
Sure.
But I guess it's not being so afraid of failure, right? And I'm sure through your own experiences as well, you have learned a lot of things through the failures that you have. And I think it's vitally important that we have those experiences, because if you win all the time, when the time comes when you don't win, then you are going to have a lot of difficulties managing that.
Yeah, I think success is a lousy teacher lah, and we learn a lot when we're actually failing. So I think that really is a great conclusion to this podcast. Thank you, Dr. Harry, for coming on.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It was an absolute pleasure to hear from you. I want to definitely listen back and then write down some of the things that I learned. People can find you on Instagram. They can find you on LinkedIn. I'll link them up. So so we can look at that. And we just wish them all the best. Stay resilient, and I hope this episode has helped you perform under pressure. Till next time. Oh yes, do share it if you find this episode useful. Share with anybody that maybe facing pressure, can be athletes, anybody in a situation. Do share with them. On Spotify as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out Spotify for more shorter bite-sized episodes. And we're also on Clubhouse as well. I'm not sure whether you know.
Oh yeah, I've heard about Clubhouse.
You'll be on there soon, because because trust me, a lot of people start going there, and you might give even talks or speeches there. But Clubhouse is a great in-audio way. I'll link it to our club below, Rebound and Resilience. You can check it out for more interactive sessions. Maybe we'll have Dr. Harry on also one of these days. So with that, bye. Take care. See you.
See y'all.